The storm came earlier than expected. The villagers said the sky had been clear that morning, pale, winter blue, quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving through the treetops like a soft breath. But by evening, clouds crawled over the mountains, thick and black, swallowing the last light of the day. Snow fell so heavily it seemed to muffle sound itself. By nightfall, the world felt sealed beneath a blanket of cold. That was when they found it. I was with them, Jonas, old Mikkel, and I. We'd been clearing the road near the forest edge, trying to make a path before the storm worsened. Snowdrifts had buried the boundary stones, and Jonas swung his spade hard, cursing the ice with each strike. But then the spade hit something that didn't ring like stone or earth. It sounded hollow. A sound that didn't belong in the middle of the forest. "Hold the lantern closer," Jonas murmured. The wind hissed through the branches, pushing back the flame. Still, I lifted it, and the light caught on something pale beneath the snow. As we brushed the frost away, a shape emerged, smooth, curved, and cold in a way that felt unnatural, even for winter. It wasn't a stone. It wasn't wood. It was carved. We cleared more snow, and slowly, the thing revealed itself, a face. Or something like a face. A figure carved entirely from ice, but the ice was wrong. It didn't melt in our hands. Didn't reflect the lantern light the way ice should. The surface was clear, but beneath it, something swirled, tiny threads of darkness drifting through the frozen body of the idol like ink suspended in water. But the worst part, the part that made my breath freeze in my throat, were the eyes. Or the lack of them. The idol had two deep hollow sockets, smooth and perfectly carved, yet bottomless. They seemed to drink the light, swallowing the glow of the lantern until the snow around us dimmed. "What in God's name is this?" Jonas whispered. Old Mikkel didn't answer. He had gone pale, his eyes locked on the idol, his body rigid with a fear I had never seen before. Mikkel had lived through wars, famines, and storms that shattered houses. But now he trembled like a child. "I've seen drawings," he murmured. "In my grandfather's book. Before this village was built, before any of our families came here." I turned to him sharply. "Explain." But the wind rose suddenly, a violent rush of icy air that cut through my coat and stabbed into my bones. The lantern flickered wildly. The trees groaned and bent toward us as if reaching. Then, without warning, everything went silent. Not quiet, silent. No wind. No creaking branches. No sound at all. The world held its breath. Jonas swallowed loudly, the noise harsh in the unnatural stillness. "What did we touch?" I whispered. The idol's hollow sockets were no longer dark. A faint blue glow stirred inside them, soft at first, like a dying ember. Then brighter. Then pulsing. The snow around it vibrated gently, as if something beneath the ground had awakened. A low hum rolled through the earth, deep and ancient, like the groan of ice shifting in a frozen cave. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. "Cover it," Mikkel said suddenly. "Bury it. Now." Before. His voice cut off. Because somewhere deep in the forest, something answered the hum. A distant, thunderous rumble echoed through the trees, too heavy to be wind, too deliberate to be nature. It was as if a colossal hand had pressed against the ground beneath us. The idol pulsed again. Blue light spilled from its empty eyes and crawled across the snow like cracks in glass. The temperature dropped so fast frost bloomed across our sleeves. "We should leave," I said, stepping back. "We shouldn't have touched it," Jonas whispered. Mikkel stared at the glowing idol, his breath trembling. "You don't understand," he said. "There were 13 of them." The earth rumbled again. Far away, something moved. And for the first time that night, I realized the storm wasn't natural. Something else had come with it. Something older than winter itself. Something we had just awakened. The wind changed on the night of the winter solstice. It wasn't a normal breeze, no, it slithered. It crawled through the trees like something alive, carrying with it a low, broken vibration. At first, Ao thought it was the branches creaking under the cold. But the sound had rhythm, intent. It rose and fell as though 1,000 distant voices were whispering the same secret all at once. And every whisper seemed to be calling his name. He had placed the unearthed idol on his cabin table earlier that evening, trying to convince himself it was simply an old relic, nothing more. But as the murmurs began, he felt it again, the same heaviness in the air that he'd felt the moment he dug it up. A pressure like unseen fingers at the back of his neck. The idol hummed. It didn't move. Yet the air around it vibrated, tiny ripples forming as though reality itself was bending inward. Shadows lengthened across the wooden floor, stretching toward the table. The fire dimmed. The glass of the lantern fogged from the inside. Ao stepped closer, heart pounding. The murmurs grew clearer. At first, they were scraps of words, ancient syllables he didn't understand. But then they sharpened, weaving themselves into a strange chant. A chant he somehow recognized, though he had never heard it before. The room shifted. The walls seemed to pull away, as though the cabin were stretching into a cavern of darkness. The temperature dropped so sharply Ao could see his breath spill out in pale clouds. And then the whispers stopped. For a heartbeat, the world was silent. Dead silent. Until... "We have been waiting." The voice didn't come from outside. It came from inside his skull, vibrating behind his eyes. He stumbled back, clutching his head. The idol was glowing now, faint, cold blue light pulsing like a heartbeat. The cabin windows shattered inward. Snow blasted through the room, swirling around the idol in a violent spiral. But the snow wasn't normal. Each flake looked like an eye, tiny, pale, blinking eyes, opening and closing as they circled him. Ao backed into the wall. The voice returned, layered, deep, ancient. "The solstice opens the gate. The idol remembers. And now, you must answer." The idol cracked. A fissure split across its stone surface, spilling out a light so cold it burned. And from inside that crack, a single whisper, soft, trembling, and unmistakably human, escaped. "Ao, don't let them in." It was his sister's voice. The sister who vanished 10 years ago. And then the murmurs rose again, louder, desperate, hungry, as the temperature plummeted and the shadows around him surged toward the idol like creatures trying to escape. Ao realized too late. The solstice was not opening a door. It was opening a mouth. And something ancient was already crawling through. The night after the solstice murmurs, Ao learned the truth. The idol didn't just hum. It summoned. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, his sister standing in a blizzard of blinking snowflakes, her mouth open in a scream he couldn't hear. By dusk, the world outside his cabin felt wrong. The trees leaned in strange directions, as if bending toward something only they could sense. The sky held no stars, just a dull, bruised gray, swirling slowly like something was turning behind it. And then the shadows arrived. He saw the first one standing by the tree lean, thin, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It only watched him with the absence where a face should have been. Ao froze. Then the second appeared beside it. Then the third. Then the fourth. Until 13 of them stood side by side, forming a silent procession at the forest's edge. They were identical, except for their eyes. Each one held a different shape of glowing red, narrow slits, wide circles, diamond-sharp pupils, swirling spirals, and one with no eyes at all, only burning cracks that leaked red light like molten blood. Ao stumbled back into the cabin and slammed the door. But the moment the lock clicked, the whispering began. Not from outside. Not from the idol. From the walls. 13 distinct voices, layered, overlapping, whispering ancient phrases in languages he had never heard. The wood vibrated. The floorboards rattled. The lantern flame shook violently as though trying to escape its own glass. Then a thud. Soft, deliberate, rhythmic. They were tapping on the walls. All around him. In a perfect circle. Ao backed toward the idol, which now pulsed like it had a heartbeat of its own. The fissure across its surface widened as if it were awakening, stretching, wanting to reveal more. The tapping stopped. Silence swallowed the cabin. Then, a voice from behind him whispered directly into his ear. The 13 shadows walked before the god. Ao whipped around, but no one stood there. Only the idol, glowing brighter. And then he saw it. 13 shadowy handprints slowly pressed themselves into the wooden walls from the inside. Each handprint long-fingered, distorted, seared into the wood as though burned by cold fire. Ao's breath stuck in his throat. The shadows outside moved for the first time. They stepped forward in perfect unison. The forest darkened. The sky twisted. The air grew heavy, thick, metallic. As the 13 shadows approached the cabin, the idol trembled violently, its cracks spreading like veins of ice. The voices returned in a whisper that seemed to crawl under his skin. The gate opens. When the 13 gather. Ao stumbled back as the shadows reached the door. And the latch began to lift on its own. Whatever waited on the other side. It wasn't human. And it wasn't coming to speak. It was coming to claim what the idol had awakened. The door never opened. It cracked. A thin fracture of ice crawled across the wood, spreading like a living vein. Frost hissed along the hinges, dripping cold mist that pooled on the floorboards like spilled breath. Ao staggered back as the air grew painfully frigid, coating his eyelashes with white crystals. Then the voices began again, but this time, they weren't whispers. They chanted. Low. Rhythmic. Ancient. The 13 shadows outside moved their arms in slow, ritualistic motions, as if reciting something older than winter itself. The idol reacted instantly. Its cracks blazed with blinding blue-white light, pulsing in perfect time with the chant. Ao covered his ears, but the sound wasn't passing through them, it was vibrating inside his skull, shaking loose memories he didn't know he had. He collapsed to his knees. The cabin darkened, then lit up with a sudden violent glare. Symbols formed on the walls. Frozen symbols. Carved in ice. They wrote themselves in long curling strokes, like invisible claws dragging across the wooden planks. The letters didn't resemble anything human, jagged spirals, diagonal slashes, looping circles that bled frost. Ao recognized one of the symbols from a story his grandmother told him as a child. A forbidden mark. A mark untouched by time. The winter scripture. Legend said it wasn't written in ink, but etched into the bones of the first people ever claimed by the old gods of the north. And now it was writing itself all around him. Ao crawled back toward the idol, desperate to stop whatever was unfolding, but the floorboards jolted violently. The glowing symbol slithered off the walls, yes, slithered, and climbed across the floor toward him like icy tendrils searching for flesh. He scrambled away, his breath turning white and ragged. Outside, the 13 shadows chanting grew harsher, faster, urgent, like a summoning reaching its final verse. Then the scripture ignited. Not with flame. With cold. A blast of freezing air erupted from the walls, sweeping across the room like a living storm. Ao screamed as frost clawed up his arms, gripping his skin with burning cold that felt like teeth. He fought it. But the scripture dragged itself across his body, carving its symbols into his skin, not cutting, not breaking, branding him with frost. Every symbol seared into him pulsed with memories not his own. He saw a frozen world, long before humans. He saw a god made of ice and starlight. He saw the 13 shadows kneeling at its feet. He saw the sun swallowed by a white eclipse. He saw the idol rise from a glacier like a heartbeat breaking through stone. And then, he felt the god notice him. A presence colder than death pressed against his mind. A voice spoke from nowhere and everywhere. The scripture chooses the Herald. Ao gasped, clutching his skull. The shadows outside fell silent instantly, as if awaiting a command. The idol cracked wide open. Inside it, instead of stone, was an eye. A single colossal eye frozen in place, drifting like a trapped star beneath the surface of ancient ice. It blinked. The entire world shook. Ao collapsed, convulsing as the scripture glowed on his skin like frostfire. The shadows knelt outside the door. The idol whispered, "You are written into the winter." The last thing Ao saw before darkness took him was the frozen eye, opening wider, reflecting his body covered in living, shifting scripture. A herald born. A herald chosen. A herald marked for a god that was waking beneath the snow. The world returned to Ao in pieces. First came the sound. A deep, distant rumble like mountains grinding their teeth beneath the earth. Then came the cold. Not the kind that stings the skin, but the kind that sinks into bone, into memory, into the parts of a person that don't heal. Then came the silence. A silence so absolute, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Ao opened his eyes. He was lying on the cabin floor, surrounded by the frozen scripture still glowing faintly on the walls, floor, and carved across his skin. The symbols moved now, slowly, like frost slithering beneath the surface of his flesh. He tried to stand. But something stopped him. Not a force. A sensation. A presence. Outside the shattered cabin window, the forest stood unnaturally still, as if time itself were afraid to move. The trees leaned inward around a clearing that hadn't existed before, wide, circular, carved from the earth as if by invisible blades. In the center of the clearing, something rose from the ground. Ice. A pillar of it, taller than a house, spiraling upward in jagged shards that refracted the moonlight into ghostly beams. Snow swirled around it in a perfect ring, suspended in the air like tiny frozen stars. Ao staggered forward, drawn to it against his will. Every step he took made the scripture burn brighter. Every breath he drew tasted ancient, older than language, older than fire, older than anything that should still exist in the world of the living. When he reached the clearing, the 13 shadows stood waiting. Not moving. Not breathing. Just watching with those red, inhuman eyes. Then, the ice pillar trembled. Ao's lungs locked. The shadows bowed. A crack split down the center of the pillar. A whisper escaped, soft and cold. "Herald." Ao's heart stopped. The voice wasn't outside. It was inside his skull, vibrating through the scripture carved into his body. The ice pulsed with light. Lines of frost branched outward across the ground like a growing web. The 13 shadows stepped back, forming a perfect circle. Ao tried to retreat, but his legs moved on their own, dragging him closer, as if the scripture were pulling him like a tether. Then the pillar split open. Not with force, but with purpose. Inside it was a shape. Tall, unearthly, curved with impossible anatomy. A figure made of blue-white ice, its limbs long and elegant, its form shifting like a living glacier. Its face held no features, only a vast void where eyes should be, glowing from deep within. It stepped out. One foot touched the earth, and every tree in the forest bent toward it. Another, and the wind froze midair around them. A third, and Ao fell to his knees as the scripture burned like fire. The creature tilted its head, as though studying him. Then the void in its face brightened, slowly, like the dawn rising behind a frozen horizon. Ao felt his soul exposed. A voice filled the clearing. The herald breathes. The gate opens. The first awakening begins. Ao screamed as the scripture flared across his body, igniting in white-blue light that shot upward like a beacon into the sky. Something enormous stirred far beneath the earth. The ground trembled. The shadows sank to their knees. And the winter god, the one sealed in ice for centuries, took its first breath in the world of men. A breath that froze the moonlight. A breath that silenced the forest. A breath that whispered Ao's name. The first awakening had begun. The first awakening had shaken the earth. But the night of the 13th wind broke it. Ao felt it before he heard it. A pressure in the air so sharp it carved through the forest like a blade. The trees bent, not with the wind, but away from something approaching. Every living thing was recoiling, withdrawing, hiding from a presence that had no footsteps, no breath, no shape. Only intent. The winter god stood silent in the clearing, its body of shifting ice pulsing like a frozen heart. The 13 shadows knelt before it, trembling as though even they feared what was coming. Ao clutched his chest as the scripture carved into his skin began to twist and writhe, rearranging its symbols on their own. The night darkened. The clouds stilled. Time hesitated. Then, the first wind blew. Not air. Not cold. A whisper carried on a gust that made the world flicker. Ao staggered back. The whisper didn't pass around him. It passed through him. It whispered his name. And 13 others. Names he'd never heard, but somehow recognized. The second wind followed. Then the third. Each one colder, sharper, more violent, ripping dead leaves from the ground and tearing them into dust. The forest groaned as though the wind were peeling layers off reality itself. By the 7th wind, the moon began to pulse like a beating heart, turning paler. Paler. Then almost blue. Ao dropped to his knees as the scripture blazed white-hot on his chest. The winter god lifted one elongated hand toward the sky. The shadows bowed lower. The 8th wind cut through the clearing like a scream. The 9th shook the frozen earth. The 10th swept through Ao's mind like a memory not his own. The 11th made the ground crack open around the clearing. The 12th made the trees kneel. Then, everything stopped. The silence was painful. Ao held his breath without meaning to. The world felt suspended, waiting for something ancient and catastrophic. When the 13th wind arrived, it didn't blow. It descended. A column of pale blue light spiraled down from the moon, touching the earth with a soft hum that made the shadows scatter backward in fear. The winter god spread its arms wide, as if greeting an old, terrible friend. Ao felt the wind enter him. Not the cold. The voices. 13 of them. Each a different tone, different age, different grief, different rage. They spoke in unison. Herald. The circle must reopen. Ao screamed as the wind tore through his mind. Images flashed in rapid pulses. A village buried under ice. A god with 13 faces. A gate carved into a glacier. A ritual repeated across centuries. A sacrifice. A chosen one. A returning god. The winter god looked down at him, its faceless void glowing brighter than ever. Ao felt the 13th wind lift him to his feet like invisible hands gripping his spine. His legs moved on their own. His voice choked itself into silence. The scripture spread across his body like living frost, wrapping his chest, arms, throat, even his face. He walked toward the winter god. Not by choice, but by command. As he reached the center of the clearing, the 13th wind spiraled around him, forming a vortex of frost and light that lifted him from the ground. The shadows gasped in their voiceless way, shivering as they bowed even deeper. The winter god spoke for the first time with a voice that split the sky. The herald rises. The 13th wind exploded outward, sweeping through the forest, tearing branches from trees, extinguishing the moonlight. Ao hung suspended in the air, glowing like a rune carved from winter itself. The world trembled. The ice beneath the earth cracked open. Something unimaginable began to stir below. Slow, vast, ancient, and hungry. And in the heart of the storm, Ao realized. The 13th wind was not a wind at all. It was a summons. And the one being summoned was awake. When the 13th wind faded, it did not leave silence behind. It left voices. Hundreds of them, layered, distorted, echoing from beneath the earth like a buried cathedral breathing in the dark. Ao collapsed to the ground as the glowing frost on his skin dimmed, leaving his body trembling and weak. The 13 shadows retreated to the tree-line, shivering as though trying to hide from what they themselves had summoned. The winter god remained still, listening. The ground beneath the clearing pulsed. Once, twice, a third time. Each pulse deeper, heavier, older. Ao knew immediately. These were not footsteps. They were heartbeats. Heartbeats of something vast. Something ancient. Something buried. Then the earth split. A jagged fracture tore across the clearing, glowing with a pale blue fire. Ice erupted upward in spiraling shards as if something beneath was forcing its way through the crust of reality. Ao stumbled back as the shadows dropped to their knees and pressed their foreheads to the frozen ground. The winter god slowly lowered its arms, its faceless void glowing with a deep, bottomless light. The voices beneath grew louder. Chanting, overlapping, screaming, whispering. All at once. Ao recognized none of the words, yet their meaning carved itself into his mind. We rise. We hunger. We return. The fracture widened. And from it, shapes emerged. At first, they looked like silhouettes. Distorted human forms made of frost and darkness. But as they climbed into the moonlight, their features spiraled into something unthinkable. Bodies carved from ancient ice, glimmering with trapped memories. Faces shifting through dozens of expressions at once, grief, rage, hunger, cycling too fast to belong to any living thing. Hands elongated like spears of frozen bone. Voices drifting from their bodies like smoke. The forgotten ones. Creatures banished in the earliest age of winter mythology. Worshippers of the winter god, erased from reality for crimes older than human memory. Now returning. Ao stumbled backward. But the scripture on his skin pulsed, holding him in place. Drawing him toward them. The first forgotten one stepped fully from the rift. Its head tilted toward Ao. Its many shifting expressions froze into one. Recognition. A voice like cracking glaciers filled the clearing. Herald, you open the path. Ao shook his head violently, tears freezing before they could fall. I didn't, I never. The scripture burned. The forgotten one extended a hand. Not to harm him. To claim him. Behind it, more crawled from the earth. 30, 50, 100. Rising like an army resurrected from the cold abyss below. Their combined presence dimmed the moon, froze the air solid, and made the shadows curl inward in terror. For the first time since its awakening, the winter god moved. Slowly, deliberately. It stepped toward the forgotten ones, its towering form casting a long, impossible shadow across the clearing. The creatures bowed to it, some collapsing entirely, their icy forms fracturing under the weight of their reverence. The winter god raised one hand. The ground stopped shaking. The voices fell silent. Time paused. Then it spoke. The age of ice returns. The forgotten ones rose in unison, faces shifting in a single synchronized wave, creating a choir of broken, ancient devotion. Ao screamed as the scripture flared white-hot on his skin, binding him to the ritual, to the god, to the forgotten ones rising from their tomb. The winter god turned its faceless void toward him. Ao felt the truth crush him. This was not an invasion. It was a return. The return of a civilization erased from memory. The return of creatures that once ruled the frozen world. The return of gods, heralds, and ancient pacts. And he, Ao, marked, carved, chosen, was the key holding the gate open. The forgotten ones lifted their heads to the frozen sky and screamed in chorus. A sound that shook mountain peaks and split ancient roots. Ao fell to his knees. The winter god's presence swallowed him. The rise had begun. The world would not survive their awakening. The village had vanished. Not physically, at least, not yet. But the world around Ao no longer resembled anything human. Snow blanketed the landscape in unnatural patterns, spiraling like runes instead of falling naturally. Trees bent unnaturally, roots twisting upward, creaking under a weight older than the mountains. The wind carried whispers of names that weren't his, faces he couldn't remember, voices that shivered through bone and blood. And the winter god waited. At the center of the clearing, the 13 shadows knelt before it, still as ice, yet brimming with silent, impossible hunger. The Forgotten Ones, risen from their frozen graves, formed a circle around Ao, their shifting faces pulsing like fractured stars. And the scripture across his skin glowed brighter than ever, a living map, binding him to the ritual. He understood, now. The winter god did not require sacrifice in blood. It required something older. Something deeper. Memory. The solstice was the hour when humans, gods, and shadows converged. When the veil between worlds thinned, the winter god demanded remembrance, a tribute to its long-forgotten dominion. Ao could feel it inside him. Every fragment of his past, every hidden fear, every lost face he tried to forget, pulsed like a heartbeat in the icy void. The scripture on his arms expanded, stretching over his chest and throat, forcing his own memories to surface. The 13 shadows rose. One by one, they circled him. Each step heavy with frost, heavy with judgment. Ao stumbled, falling to his knees. The Forgotten Ones closed in, their hollow eyes reflecting his deepest regrets. Their frozen fingers brushed his arms, scanning his mind, pulling fragments of the life he thought he owned. The winter god's voice rang out, low, resonant, impossible. The offering must be complete, or the solstice devours all. Ao screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. Around him, the ground itself began to split, frost spreading across the earth like veins of ice, pulsing with blue-white light. Each crack hummed with voices from beyond, chanting in unison, repeating words older than human understanding. Memories he had buried for decades rose unbidden, faces of friends, forgotten promises, sins he never confessed. Each one extracted a tremor from his body, burning through him as the winter god fed on them. The shadow's chant grew louder, synchronized with the scripture on his skin, a terrifying symphony of devotion and doom. And then, he understood fully. The solstice offering was himself. Every thought, every fear, every secret, every memory was the currency the winter god demanded. It would consume, rewrite, and reshape the human essence to awaken fully. And the longer the ritual went, the more the world around him became a frozen echo of the winter god's domain. The Forgotten Ones raised their arms. Snow swirled violently, forming shapes of long-forgotten cities beneath the ice, of gods walking among men. Ao's consciousness was pulled in every direction, toward the past, the void beneath the mountains, the rising forms of the 13 frozen gods. And the winter god spoke once more. The herald offers. The gate opens. All shall remember. Ao felt his memories, the very essence of his identity, being drawn out of him, spiraling upward into the cold sky. It wasn't pain. It wasn't pleasure. It was existence being rewritten. He screamed. The snow, the wind, the shadows, the Forgotten Ones, and the winter god, all rose into one impossible symphony of ice and memory. And in that terrible hour, he realized. The solstice offering was not a gift. It was a transformation. A warning. And the winter god had begun to reclaim its ancient dominion. The night stretched endlessly. And Ao, he was no longer simply human. He was the herald of the winter gods. The night was alive. Not with wind, not with snow, but with anticipation. Every tree in the forest leaned inward, shadows pooling unnaturally. Every sound, the cracking of ice, the faint whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a fox, was magnified into a scream that seemed to echo from the underworld itself. Ao stood at the center of the clearing, the scripture still glowing across his skin, now fully a part of him. The 13 shadows hovered nearby, obedient, silent, watching. The Forgotten Ones formed a circle around them all, faces twisting in impossible, frozen expressions. And above, the sky churned, a bruised, violet-black dome swirling with cold fire. The winter god opened its faceless void toward the earth, and the air trembled. Its presence was vast, infinite, pressing against reality like a glacier crushing a valley. Then the ground split. Cracks raced across the snow, widening and glowing blue-white, releasing a sound like ice tearing in slow motion. From the fissures, they emerged. The 13 frozen gods, immense, ancient, monstrous, each taller than the tallest tree, each carved from frost, bone, and shadow. Their faces held hollow voids, glowing faintly from deep within. Their limbs moved with a grace that defied physics. Their eyes, when they blinked into existence, burned with memories of ages long erased. The first footstep shattered frozen ground like crystal glass. The second sent tremors racing across the forest. The third made the air itself hiss with electricity. The winter god raised one arm, long as a mountain peak. The 13 shadows mirrored it perfectly. The forgotten ones bowed. And Ao, his chest ablaze with scripture, understood his role fully. He was the herald, the conduit, the key. Without him, the 13 could not fully walk among men. And now, they did. The first god stepped from the fissure. Snow exploded around its ankles. The second followed, then the third. One by one, they moved across the clearing, leaving the world behind them cracked, frozen, twisted in unnatural ways. With each step, the forest shrieked and bent. With each step, the night became darker, heavier, colder. Ao could hear whispers rising from the snow, whispers in languages that had not been spoken since the dawn of winter, echoing in his mind, urging him forward, urging him to lead them to the village, to humanity. The winter god's voice boomed, not through air, but directly into his consciousness. The 13 walk. The world bends. The time of men ends. You are our herald. Ao fell to his knees, overwhelmed, powerless to resist. He could feel the 13's consciousness pressing against the edges of his mind, old and infinite, demanding acknowledgement, demanding worship, demanding fear. In the village, lights flickered and went out. Dogs barked into empty air. Windows rattled. Every human being within miles felt the world shift, though none could name why. The cold of the 13 seeped into homes, into hearts, into bones, leaving dread in its wake. The winter god spread its colossal arms wide, and the 13 followed, stepping beyond the clearing, walking finally among the world they had been denied for centuries. Ao's vision blurred. He saw his own reflection in the snow, a body marked by the scripture, eyes wide with horror, veins glowing with frost fire. He realized with unbearable clarity, he was no longer himself. He was the bridge. The herald. The vessel of remembrance for gods older than humanity. The snow deepened, swirling around him and the gods. The wind sang in the voices of the 13, carrying curses and promises, memories and judgments, and the world shifted under their step. And in that moment, Ao understood the terrifying truth. The 13 frozen gods did not just walk. They claimed. They remembered. They returned. The world as men knew it ended that night. And from the frost, the age of the winter gods began.